U.S. President Joe Biden is summoning congressional leaders to the White House next week to try and hash out the partisan dispute over the debt ceiling. Biden is calling all four of either party's leaders in the House and Senate to sit down for discussions. The move comes after the Treasury warned the government would be likely to default on some bills as early as June if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling.
The yeas are 217, the nays are 215, the bill is passed.
A bill passed by House Republicans last week to raise the debt limit includes steep spending cuts, which the Democratic-controlled Senate said they will not approve.
The full faith and credit of the United States cannot be held hostage. For months, we asked Speaker McCarthy and Republicans to present a plan, a real plan, to avoid default with no brinksmanship, no hostage-taking. But instead of presenting a viable plan, last week, Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans passed the Default on America Act, a hard-right ransom note to the American people.
The White House has insisted on a ceiling increase with no strings attached. Biden has said he will only negotiate on budget cuts after a new limit is set.
The most important thing we have to do in that regard is to make sure the threat by the Speaker of the House to default on the national debt is off the table.
Washington regularly sets a limit on federal borrowing, but also periodically lifts that limit to pay for spending Congress has already authorized.
For over 200 years, America has never, ever, ever failed to pay its debt. To put in the capital in colloquial terms, America is not a deadbeat nation.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and other policy experts have called on Washington to remove the limit, saying it amounts to a bureaucratic stamp on decisions already made.
As you know,
Yellen has warned that a June debt default would, quote, trigger an economic and financial catastrophe. However, the debt ceiling is supported by both Democrats and Republicans, and both parties have used it as leverage when their party doesn't control the White House. In 2011, House Republicans successfully used the debt ceiling to extract discretionary spending limits from Democratic President Barack Obama. The showdown took the country to the brink of default and led to a downgrade of the country's top-notch credit rating.
One factor that makes this a bit special is that this is the first budget after the Republicans reconquered the House and Congress in November. So this is part of the power balance reset. Now the Democrats, who of course control the White House and the Senate, they need to probably offer some concessions to the Republicans. So this is a sort of part of the negotiation fight. Then a second factor, which is special, analytically interesting in this case, is that we are part of a quantitative tightening period for the first time in decades. So this is also a major part of this drama. And the third factor, which is also important, is that this is sort of the first budget following the Black Swan pandemic event when unprecedented levels of cash were splashed out. So these three factors together makes this a special case. And so it might be as dramatic as in 2011 when there was also big drama. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody wants to see that the budget will not be passed, because that will create maybe possibly a recession. Well, I think it's part of the show. I think everyone sort of knows behind the scenes that something, in the end, there will be some sort of agreements, but it's part of the negotiation battle. So it's actually political theater. It's a spectacle. They are pushing both sides to pretend that they have red lines. They probably don't have red lines, but they will. From both sides are trying to make the other ones make concessions as much as possible. And media is, of course, part of the drama. So they have to say we will never give in and all that. And that has happened before. But at the end of the day, possibly 2 minutes to midnight, they will both give in, most likely, and there will be some sort of compromise. Oh, yes, absolutely. I think it is really part of the power balance reset. And I think the Republicans are a bit stronger than they have been for several years, just because they did reconquer the House of Congress. But since they didn't reconquer the Senate, there is still a power balance between the two, the Republicans and Democrats. So it's hard to see how this will end in the end. Or in one sense, it's not hard to see, because it is, as mentioned before, it is most likely that there will be compromises on both sides. They will have to give in both sides, and they will have to be able to show to their own within their own, both sides will have to show on their own side that they have been winning something. So there have to be some sort of face-saving compromise, and I think that's always the case when you have a big political controversy. In the end, despite all the smoke and dust, there will be compromises, and both sides will have to go in some ways, and there will be talks about moralistic talk about budget cuts, and we have to cut budgets in the future, and that will be part of the game this time too. This is, of course, also that's an interesting factor as well. This budget, it will be so. What comes out of the budget discussions that will go feed into the election campaign. So both sides will have to will use the PR spin to present a case which will look favorable to them. But it is probably likely that he will have to offer some sort of concessions to the Republicans. He will spin it as if he hasn't done so, but probably it will be it might be a bit of a problem for him, because it's hard to see how he can push further. He'll probably have to offer concessions rather than the other way around, given the power balance reset we talked about previously.
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.